David Miller said, on a quiet evening, James Carter sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills and foreclosure notices. The ceiling fan hummed faintly until James Carter's phone buzzed. James Carter answered, and a cold voice said, "Mr. Carter, your payment has defaulted again." David Miller said. James Carter's chest tightened as the words struck him like a hammer. James Carter whispered, "I'll find a way, just give me time." The caller replied, "Time is over, your house is next." David Miller said. The papers slipped from James Carter's trembling hands, scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. Laura Carter entered, her face pale with fear, and asked, "James, is it happening?" David Miller said. James Carter lowered his gaze as dread swelled, realizing the nightmare had truly begun. David Miller said, the next morning sunlight broke weakly through gray clouds, but James Carter felt no warmth. James Carter stood by the kitchen counter, coffee untouched, staring blankly out the window. Ethan Carter bounded in with his backpack and asked, "Dad, will we still live here when school starts?" James Carter's throat tightened, but Laura Carter quickly replied, "Of course, Ethan, now hurry or you'll be late." David Miller said. Ethan Carter dashed off, leaving James Carter and Laura Carter in heavy silence. James Carter muttered, "I can't protect him from this, Laura." Laura Carter touched James Carter's arm and whispered, "You can if you fight." David Miller said. Laura Carter's faith stung as much as it soothed, reminding James Carter that this battle was no longer just about money, but about keeping his family together. David Miller said later that day, James Carter sat in his car outside the bank, his reflection blurred in the windshield. James Carter whispered, "This building holds my fate." David Miller said, the glass doors loomed like gates of judgment. Inside, Richard Hale greeted James Carter with a cold smile and said, "Mr. Carter, numbers do not bend for desperation." James Carter replied, "I'm not asking for sympathy, only time." Richard Hale leaned back and said, "Time is the one asset you've already lost." David Miller said. The exchange pierced James Carter like a blade. Walking out, James Carter's shoulders sagged as the city's noise grew harsher. David Miller said. James Carter realized the bank was not just an institution, but an adversary ready to strip him of everything. David Miller said. As dusk settled, James Carter walked home through narrow streets, the world blurred by exhaustion. Neon signs flickered, mocking his despair. At the diner, Michael Turner waved and said, "James, you look like hell. What's going on?" James Carter sighed. "They're coming for my house." David Miller said. Michael Turner's expression hardened with loyalty as he answered, "Then you won't face it alone." David Miller said. The words offered comfort, yet James Carter knew loyalty could not erase debt. Still, that flicker of solidarity steadied James Carter's breath. David Miller said, for the first time that day, James Carter felt less like a man drowning and more like someone clinging to a fragile lifeline. David Miller said, that night, James Carter returned home, greeted by silence. Laura Carter sat at the dining table, sorting through envelopes with trembling hands. Laura Carter asked, "Did they give you more time?" James Carter shook his head and whispered, "They want the house." David Miller said. Laura Carter's eyes welled with tears, but she forced strength into her voice as she answered, "Then we fight harder." James Carter held Laura Carter's hand across the table, the weight of her faith pressing against his doubt. Outside, thunder rolled, echoing their turmoil. David Miller said, though the bank sought to strip James Carter of walls and roof, it could not yet take the bond he shared with Laura Carter and Ethan Carter, and that bond would be his weapon in the battles ahead. David Miller said. James Carter walked into his modest living room, carrying the weight of unspoken fear. Laura Carter sat on the couch folding laundry, while Ethan Carter played quietly with his toy cars on the carpet. James Carter paused, taking in the fragile peace of the room before saying, "I'm sorry I can't give you certainty." Laura Carter looked up, her eyes red but steady, and whispered, "We don't need certainty, James. We need you to keep fighting." Ethan Carter glanced up, sensing tension he could not understand, and asked, "Dad, Why are you sad again? James Carter forced a smile and said, I'm just thinking too much, Ethan. David Miller said, the living room felt like a sanctuary threatened by invisible walls closing in. A reminder that this battle was about protecting more than bricks and mortar. David Miller said that evening, James Carter met Michael Turner at a small cafe on Main Street, where the hum of conversations mixed with the clink of coffee cups. Michael Turner leaned forward and said, James, tell me everything, don't hold back. James Carter rubbed his forehead and muttered, the bank manager Richard Hale has left me no room. Foreclosure is looming. Michael Turner clenched his jaw and replied, then you need allies, not pity. David Miller said, the cafe's warm glow contrasted with James Carter's cold reality, yet Michael Turner's loyalty felt like a spark of hope in a storm. James Carter looked at his friend and said, I don't even know who I can trust anymore. Michael Turner answered firmly, you can trust me. David Miller said, James Carter returned home late that night, finding Laura Carter seated at the dining table with her laptop open and spreadsheets glowing across the screen. Laura Carter said, I've been going through the accounts, James. We're deeper than I thought. James Carter sat down heavily and muttered, every number feels like a noose tightening around us. David Miller said, Laura Carter's determination was sharp, even through exhaustion, and her role had shifted from quiet supporter to strategist. Laura Carter looked at James Carter and said, if we face this together, we'll find a way. James Carter reached for her hand and whispered, I don't deserve you. David Miller said in that moment, the Carter family's fight began to look less like surrender and more like survival. David Miller said, the next morning James Carter met Samuel Blake, a former mentor who had once been a respected financial advisor, but now lived in obscurity. Samuel Blake sat across from James Carter at a worn wooden bench in the park and said, you think the system is fair, James? It never was. James Carter frowned and answered, I just want to save my house. Samuel Blake laughed bitterly and replied, then you'll need to fight dirtier than you're used to. David Miller said, Samuel Blake's once sharp eyes were tired, but carried the weight of lessons learned in failure. James Carter asked quietly, and what did it cost you, Samuel? Samuel Blake sighed and said, everything. David Miller said, later that day James Carter sat in his car parked outside Ethan Carter's school, watching children rush out with laughter and backpacks bouncing. Ethan Carter spotted James Carter and waved, running toward him with joy. Ethan Carter climbed in and said, Dad, did you see me win the race today? James Carter forced a smile and said, I'm proud of you, Ethan. David Miller said, the sound of Ethan Carter's voice was a fragile reminder of innocence, untouched by debt or foreclosure. James Carter's smile faltered as he whispered to himself, I have to win this fight for him. David Miller said in that moment, James Carter realized the stakes were not just financial but deeply human, anchored in the simple hope of protecting his son's life. When? And? David Miller said. James Carter walked into the bank once more, his jaw tight and his fists clenched. Richard Hale sat behind his polished desk, the weight of authority etched across every gesture. Richard Hale said, You cannot escape the contract, Mr. Carter. James Carter replied, You profit from ruin, Richard. You want my house, not my repayment. David Miller said. The conversation was less about numbers and more about control, and James Carter realized he was trapped in a game where rules bent for the powerful. Richard Hale leaned back and said, Your house will be gone within weeks. James Carter's voice broke as he answered, You may take the house, but you will never own my family's will. David Miller said. The tension between James Carter and Richard Hale hung like smoke, bitter and suffocating. David Miller said, that night, James Carter sat in his living room, staring at unpaid bills spread across the coffee table. Laura Carter stood beside him, her face pale but determined. Laura Carter said, James, we need outside help. You cannot carry this alone. James Carter rubbed his temples and muttered, Every deal feels like a trap waiting to snap shut. David Miller said, the strain on James Carter's marriage weighed heavier than the debt itself, and silence cut deeper than words. Laura Carter took his hand and whispered, You are not just fighting for money, James. You are fighting for us. David Miller said. The Carter family's resolve hardened in the quiet, though the shadows of looming betrayal pressed against their fragile unity. David Miller said. The following day, James Carter met Victoria Lang, an investor known for sharp instincts and ruthless conditions. Victoria Lang extended her hand with a polished smile and said, "I can save you, James, but everything comes with a price." James Carter studied her carefully and replied, "And what is that price, Victoria?" Victoria Lang leaned closer and whispered, "Control. I don't just invest in businesses, I own futures." David Miller said. The air between them thickened with unease as James Carter weighed hope against the risk of surrender. James Carter clenched his jaw and said, "I want survival, not slavery." David Miller said. Victoria Lang's smirk made it clear she already held more power than she revealed. David Miller said later that evening, Michael Turner joined James Carter at the diner booth, where neon lights flickered through the window. Michael Turner leaned in and said, "I don't like Victoria Lang. She plays for herself, not for you." James Carter sighed and answered, "But without her money, foreclosure will take us." Michael Turner gritted his teeth and said, "Then we find another way, James. Trust doesn't come with contracts." David Miller said. James Carter stared into his coffee, torn between desperation and loyalty. James Carter finally whispered, "I'm running out of time, Michael." Michael Turner said firmly, "Then lean on me, not a vulture in a suit." David Miller said. The flicker of neon painted their faces like a warning fragile hope, clashing with cold reality. David Miller said. The next morning, Laura Carter visited her sister Anna Carter, seeking comfort in family. Anna Carter embraced Laura Carter and said, "You cannot carry James' burden alone." Laura Carter whispered, "If we lose the house, Ethan loses his world." David Miller said. The bond between Laura Carter and Anna Carter revealed the hidden victims of debt, the ones who lived in its shadows. Anna Carter looked into her sister's eyes and said, "James Carter must know he is not fighting only for himself, but for all of us." Laura Carter nodded slowly and replied, "Then we stand together." David Miller said. In that quiet moment, the Carter family's survival became a collective vow, etched deeper than any contract. David Miller said. James Carter sat across from Victoria Lang in a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline. Victoria Lang tapped her pen against the contract and said, "Sign this, and your house is safe, for now." James Carter studied the fine print, his stomach sinking. James Carter asked, "What's hidden in these clauses, Victoria?" Victoria Lang smirked and replied, "Control, James. Every future decision will pass through me." David Miller said. The revelation struck James Carter like a blow. The investment was not a lifeline but a leash. James Carter's voice cracked as he muttered, "You don't want to help me, you want to own me." Victoria Lang leaned back, her smile sharp, and said, "Ownership is the only true security." David Miller said. Later that evening, Michael Turner confronted James Carter outside the diner, neon buzzing overhead. Michael Turner said, "I warned you about Victoria Lang. She'll bleed you dry." James Carter's eyes burned with frustration as he replied, "What choice do I have, Michael? Richard Hale is already circling my house." Michael Turner grabbed James Carter's shoulder and said, "You still have me, and you still have family. Don't sell yourself to someone worse than the bank." David Miller said. The tension between friendship and desperation carved deep lines in James Carter's face. James Carter muttered, "If I lose everything, what good am I to anyone?" Michael Turner's voice hardened. "You'll still be you, James. That's worth more than any house." David Miller said. The next morning, Samuel Blake invited James Carter into his cramped apartment filled with dusty books and unpaid bills. Samuel Blake said, "You want to know the truth, James? Richard Hale and Victoria Lang have been working together for years." James Carter stiffened and asked, "Together? Why would they do that?" Samuel Blake chuckled bitterly and said, "Because ruin is profitable. They profit from both ends, foreclosure and fake salvation." David Miller said, James Carter's heart pounded as betrayal stitched itself into the very fabric of his crisis. James Carter muttered, "I walked into a trap." Samuel Blake leaned forward, his voice gravelly. "And the only way out is to fight the trapmakers at their own game." David Miller said, later that day, Laura Carter discovered a letter tucked between the bills, its words striking like lightning. Laura Carter read aloud, "Richard Hale has already filed the foreclosure order." James Carter dropped his head into his hands and whispered, "They never planned to wait." Laura Carter clenched her fists and said, "Then we fight in court, James. We will not surrender quietly." David Miller said. Laura Carter's voice carried a defiance that burned brighter than James Carter's despair. James Carter looked at her with a mix of love and guilt and said, "You deserve better than this war." Laura Carter answered firmly, "I deserve the truth, and so does Ethan Carter." David Miller said, "The Carter family stood on the edge of open battle, their unity forged in fire." David Miller said, "That evening, James Carter drove through the rain, headlights slicing through darkness as he replayed Samuel Blake's revelation." James Carter gripped the wheel and muttered, "Richard Hale and Victoria Lang set me up from the start." David Miller said, "The rain hammered harder, mirroring the storm inside James Carter's chest." James Carter whispered, "I won't let them destroy us." His voice grew stronger as he repeated, "I won't let them destroy us." David Miller said, in that vow, James Carter shifted from prey to hunter. For the first time, his despair gave way to resolve. The trap was real, but now he saw its edges clearly, and clarity meant the chance to fight back. David Miller said. James Carter stormed into Richard Hale's office, rain still dripping from his coat, his eyes burning with fury. Richard Hale looked up with a smirk and said, "You are late, James. The house will be ours in days." James Carter slammed his fists on the desk and shouted, "You set me up with Victoria Lang. I know everything." Richard Hale's smirk faded as he leaned back and replied, "Prove it." David Miller said. The confrontation ignited the room, authority clashing with defiance. James Carter's voice trembled with controlled rage as he said, "I'll fight you in the light of day, Richard. You won't win in the shadows forever." David Miller said. The power dynamic shifted as James Carter's desperation hardened into defiance. David Miller said. That night, James Carter gathered Laura Carter and Michael Turner at the dining table, their faces lit by a single lamp. James Carter said, "Richard Hale and Victoria Lang want to take everything, but they left a trail of lies." Laura Carter leaned forward and said, "Then we expose them." Michael Turner nodded and added, "We fight fire with truth, James." David Miller said. The trio formed a circle of resolve, their unity sharper than the fear pressing against them. James Carter's eyes glistened as he whispered, "This may be our last chance." Laura Carter squeezed his hand and said, "Then we take it together." David Miller said. For the first time, the Carter home felt like a war room instead of a prison. David Miller said, the following day, James Carter entered the courthouse, the weight of the battle pressing against his shoulders. Victoria Lang met him in the hallway, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Victoria Lang said, "You can still surrender, James. Sign, and this ends quietly." James Carter straightened his back and replied, "I'd rather lose everything than live as your puppet." Victoria Lang smirked and said, "Then watch your empire crumble." David Miller said. The courthouse hallway became an arena, pride clashing with survival, shadows of law stretching over both combatants. James Carter whispered, "You underestimate me, Victoria." David Miller said, it was no longer a negotiation but a duel fought with paper blades and hidden truths. David Miller said. Inside the courtroom, the silence was electric as James Carter faced Richard Hale across polished wooden benches. Richard Hale said, "You are finished, Carter. Admit it and walk away." James Carter stood and raised a folder of evidence saying, "This shows collusion between you and Victoria Lang. You profit from destruction." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard Hale's face darkened as he muttered, "You have no right." David Miller said. The courtroom's air cracked with tension, justice and corruption clashing under fluorescent lights. James Carter's voice thundered, "You will not steal my family's home without a fight." David Miller said. The climax of James Carter's battle turned the quiet courtroom into a battlefield of truth. David Miller said, after court adjourned, James Carter stood outside on the courthouse steps, rain giving way to sunlight breaking through clouds. Michael Turner clapped him on the back and said, "You did it, James, you stood up to them." Laura Carter wrapped her arms around James Carter and whispered, "We are proud of you." David Miller said, the weight of survival pressed on, but James Carter had proven he would not be broken. Ethan Carter ran up, clutching James Carter's hand and said, "Dad, are we safe now?" James Carter bent down, hugged Ethan Carter and said, "We're safer than before." David Miller said, "It was not the end of the war, but it was a victory carved from courage, a climax burning into hope." David Miller said, James Carter returned home after the trial, the house quiet except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. Laura Carter set dinner on the table and asked softly, "Do we have a chance now?" James Carter sat down slowly and replied, "The court delayed foreclosure is not over, but we bought time." Ethan Carter carried his school books to the table and said, "Then that means we're still here, right?" James Carter smiled faintly and answered, "Yes, Ethan, we're still here." David Miller said. The Carter family gathered in silence, the meal untouched at first, but the weight of survival settled like fragile victory on their shoulders. The home remained theirs, at least for now, and that moment was worth holding. David Miller said. The next morning, James Carter met Michael Turner at the diner once more, the neon sign flickering in daylight. Michael Turner leaned across the booth and said, "You fought harder than anyone thought you could." James Carter sighed and replied, "And yet the debt still hangs like a storm cloud." Michael Turner smiled faintly and said, "Storms pass, James, but courage that lasts." David Miller said. The two friends shared quiet coffee, their bond hardened by battle and tempered by loyalty. James Carter whispered, "I thought I'd lost everything, Michael, but I found something stronger." Michael Turner raised his cup and said, "To survival." David Miller said, "It was not triumph, but it was resilience, and resilience meant a second chance." David Miller said later that week, James Carter visited Samuel Blake at the park bench where their talks had begun. Samuel Blake handed James Carter a folder and said, "These are documents that prove more of Richard Hale's schemes." James Carter frowned and asked, "Why are you helping me now, Samuel?" Samuel Blake's eyes softened as he said, "Because I once lost everything, and I don't want you to repeat my fate." David Miller said. James Carter accepted the folder, his respect for Samuel Blake deepening despite the man's broken past. James Carter said quietly, "You may have fallen, Samuel, but your wisdom still matters." David Miller said, in that moment, both men carried the scars of debt, but one was helping the other rise. David Miller said, inside the kitchen, Laura Carter sat with Anna Carter, sipping tea as the storm outside finally cleared. Anna Carter said, "James is stronger than he thinks, Laura, but he needs you steady beside him." Laura Carter nodded and replied, "I won't let debt take away the family we built." David Miller said, the sisters spoke not as victims but as anchors, each holding the other against the tides of fear. Anna Carter said, "Ethan needs to see strength in both of you." Laura Carter smiled faintly and whispered, "Then strength is what he'll see." David Miller said, the Carter family's foundation was no longer just walls and bricks, but resilience woven through blood and love. David Miller said, on a quiet Sunday morning, James Carter walked barefoot across his living room, the house bathed in golden light. Ethan Carter built a tower of blocks on the carpet and laughed when it collapsed. Laura Carter entered carrying coffee and smiled, saying, "This is home, James, no matter what they try to take." James Carter crouched beside Ethan Carter and whispered, "We're still standing, and that's enough." David Miller said, the Carter home remained under threat, but it was alive, warm, and unbroken. Michael Turner's voice echoed in James Carter's memory, "Storms pass, but courage lasts." David Miller said, for the first time, James Carter felt peace, not because the war was over, but because the fight had meaning. David Miller said, James Carter sat alone in his study, foreclosure papers stacked neatly beside him, the desk lamp casting a dim glow. James Carter whispered, "They nearly took everything, but they did not take me," David Miller said. For the first time, James Carter's voice carried not fear, but strength. Laura Carter entered quietly and placed her hand on James Carter's shoulder, saying, "We are still standing, James. And that is enough," David Miller said. In that small gesture, the war outside faded for a moment, replaced by the simple truth of survival. James Carter closed his eyes and said, "Home is not walls, it is us." David Miller said the papers remained, but the man who once trembled before them no longer did. David Miller said, the next morning, James Carter stood outside his house, watching Ethan Carter race across the yard with laughter echoing in the crisp air. James Carter smiled faintly and said, "That sound is worth more than any contract." Laura Carter stepped onto the porch and said, "He doesn't know how close we came to losing this." James Carter replied softly, "And I pray he never does." David Miller said, "The sun broke through gray skies, painting the house in gold, as if blessing its walls with temporary peace." James Carter whispered, "Let the bankers keep their ledgers. I have something they can never own." David Miller said, "The laughter of Ethan Carter became the anthem of survival." David Miller said, at the courthouse steps, Richard Hale faced reporters with cameras flashing. Richard Hale said, "This case means nothing. The system is intact." David Miller said, but behind his polished words, cracks appeared in his confidence. Across the street, Victoria Lang spoke sharply into her phone, her smile gone. James Carter watched from a distance and whispered, "They are not invincible." Laura Carter joined him and said, "They will fall, James, and we will be here when they do." David Miller said, for the first time, the giants who threatened the Carter family looked smaller, their shadows weakened by truth. James Carter turned away, his voice steady. "Their empire was built on ruin. Ours is built on resilience." David Miller said, that evening, Samuel Blake sat with James Carter on the same worn park bench where truth had first been shared. Samuel Blake said, "You fought where I once failed, James." James Carter replied, "I only fought because you showed me the truth." Samuel Blake's eyes softened, and he said, "Maybe redemption is found not in winning, but in helping another fight." David Miller said, "The park was quiet, autumn leaves rustling in a gentle wind, and two men scarred by debt found unexpected peace." James Carter said, "Your fall became my warning, Samuel. You saved me more than you know." David Miller said, "The mentor's legacy lived on, not in fortune, but in the survival of another man's home." David Miller said, on the final night, James Carter stood at the window of his home, rain streaking the glass, lightning flashing in the distance. Laura Carter joined him and whispered, "Do you think it's over?" James Carter answered, "No, but we are stronger now." Ethan Carter's voice called faintly from the hallway, "Good night, Mom and Dad." David Miller said, the storm outside mirrored the battles still ahead, but inside, the Carter family stood together. James Carter placed his hand against the glass and whispered, "They tried to take my house. They failed. And even if walls fall, they will never own my soul." David Miller said. The screen faded on James Carter's silhouette, a man scarred but unbroken, leaving the audience with silence heavy as thunder.